This year's theme is Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in Fractured Times. This is the 6th Seymour Symposium, named for our pastor emeritus, Dr. Robert Seymour. Dr. Seymour, for 30 years, was the senior minister here at Binkley, and he began his pastoral ministry here shortly after the church was founded, in fractured times, to be sure. 60 years ago, Chapel Hill, North Carolina was much different than it is today. In fact, just this weekend, we remembered the Chapel Hill Nine, those who sat at Colonial Drug Store on February the 28th, 1960. 4 of those still live in Chapel Hill. We admire their courage, and we admire and appreciate the remarkable ministry that Dr. Seymour had in a different time, filled with much fracture. Dr. Seymour and his daughter Frances are with us today. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Seymour? This and the previous 5 symposiums are meant as a gift to our community, where this congregation and others of goodwill seek to locate the intersection of thoughtful learning, good discourse around issues of justice and peace, and try to find the common good for all members of our community. The past is never dead, Faulkner said. It's not even past. As events on our Carolina campus this past year testify, we still are in fractured times. Annie Dillard said, "I am a frayed and nibbled survivor trying to get along in this old world." That's still true today. Some announcements for us. We want to thank our friends from WCHL who assisted us in the promotion of our event. We want to make you aware that there are bathrooms located all over the building. You'll find them. And the parking folks want me to remind you that things could get ugly if you do not observe the one-way direction signs. Now, friends, that's the first time in the history of this pulpit anyone has ever said there's only one way. But if you don't observe this, it will get ugly. I asked my colleague, Stephanie Ford, to come and make a quick announcement about children's activities. Stephanie?
We are delighted to welcome children among us, and in about a minute, I'd like to invite those children to meet us at the glass doors over here on the right, or it's your left, and where Kimberly is waving there. Our effort is to keep all children safe while they're in our building, and so we ask that you make sure that your child has a form filled out and that you sign your child in and then sign your child out. And signing out is going to be interesting because the children are coming back for the Barbie's Chapel dance group at noon, and so they will be coming in back the same way, and there's a table there to sign them out. So please make sure to sign out at the table just outside those doors. Thank you.
In just a moment, Susan Rogers will come and give a more detailed introduction of our speaker, Dr. Jones. I've been asked to lead us in a time of prayer, and the prayer comes from Walter Brueggemann, entitled, "With All the Graciousness We Can Muster." Let us pray. God of our times, our years, and our days, you are the God of our work, of our rest, of our weariness. So our times are in your hands. We come to you now in our strength and in our weakness, in our hope and in our despair. in our buoyancy, and in our dis-ease. We come to pray for ourselves and for all like us who seek and yearn for life anew with you, from you, with you, and with others. We pray to you this day for ourselves and others like us in our greed, for we are among those who want more power, more money, more piety, more influence, more doctrine, more notice, more members, more students, more morality, more learning. But for us, enough and more than enough, for we know about your self-giving, gracious generosity. So we pray to you this day and for ourselves and others like us, that in our disconsolation, we realize we're not far removed from those without love, without home, without hope, without job, without health care. We are close enough to vision those who must rummage and scavenge for food and for grace, for their hungers are close to ours. Be among us as the one who fills the hungry with good things and sends the rich away empty. We pray to you this day for ourselves and others like us who are propelled by and for your best causes, who try to be on the right side of every issue, but who wear ourselves out in obedience to you and sometimes wear others out with our good intentions. So be among us. For beauty and grace are present. May we be present to it. And guide us to see that differences do not have to deepen into caustic and acrimonious division. For we wish to live gracious lives. We pray this in the name of the one who taught that truth isn't to be feared, and whose life was an extension of never-ending grace. Amen. Susan?
Good morning. My name is Susan Rogers, and I'm a member of Binkley Baptist Church. Today, it is my privilege to introduce the keynote speaker for this year's Seymour Symposium, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, president of Union Theological Seminary and the first woman to hold that position in the seminary's history. Reverend Dr. Jones also occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy at Union. When Paul Lindsay, one of the two marvelous co-chairs of the symposium, the other being Linnea Smith, asked me to introduce Dr. Jones, he wrote, "We would like you to do an upbeat, thoughtful introduction. Not a long, typically dull listing of Serene's academic pedigree." So, with that direction in mind, I ask for Dr. Jones' forgiveness in advance for any creativity that's gone astray, and offer a brief introduction about what having Dr. Jones here as theologian, a self-defined fierce one, as teacher, as preacher, can mean for this weekend on finding sustenance and grace in the midst of what seems is an ever-coarsening and graceless culture, void of listening, void of relationship building, little national community. Dr. Jones' next book will be released on March the 19th. It is entitled, "Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World." As I read the introduction to Call It Grace, I wrote down the following. Come, tell me your story. Come, hear my story. Why does the thought of hearing one another's stories make us so fearful? For the grace of God is in your story. The grace of God is in Dr. Jones' story. And the grace of God is in my story. Amen. When a nation separates children from families whose only crime is the search for a better life, when calls for a green revolution are met with voices of the scornful and eyes of the blind, when clergy and church leaders of yet another body of Christ, this time a Baptist part, are discovered having sexually abused 700 victims over 20 years. And when a global Christian denomination continues to refuse to listen to, much less celebrate, the stories of its LGBTQ members, families, and clergy, it is time for what Dr. Jones offers and what we can offer: a different public language constructed from our shared stories, a grace-infused public vocabulary where we return to the public square as people of faith in a God of grace and as prophetic followers of Jesus, not proselytizers of religious dogma. As I read the introduction to Dr. Jones' Call It Grace, my own concept of grace came to mind. I call it the aha moment, and it's most eloquently described for me by the Apostle Paul. For now we see through a glass darkly, and then face to face. Aha. Now I know in part, but then shall I know as I am also known. Aha. That is for me the overwhelming grace of God. It catches me by surprise. It takes my breath. It's like being in love. It is love. I am known. You know me. How great is that? Come, tell me your story. Come, hear my story. Dr. Jones, I cannot wait to read the rest of Call It Grace. It drops on March 19. Don't forget that. And all of us here are so grateful for this opportunity to listen to your story in this place. Thank you for being here. Welcome to Binkley.
So I liked Paul Lindsay until I learned that he'd asked Susan to do this, and I could just sit down now because Susan gave my entire lecture. That was beautiful. Thank you. Paul, where are you? That was wonderful. It's a delight to be here in this historic congregation, to be with a community that sits close to the heart of my commitments, the commitments of Union, the commitments of so many of us who in these fractured times are struggling together to move our world forward and to reflect the grace that abounds there. I want to say a special word of thank you to Reverend Seymour. You were right back there. Thank you so much for your ministry and for the original act of protest and the witness to grace that brings me here today to do this in your honor. May you be here for many more of these lectures. I also want to say again thank you to Paul and Linnea, Claudia, Cheryl, Charles. I'm sure I'm missing some of the other names of the people who were on the planning committee. You won't be surprised to hear, but this is the best planned visit to a church that I have ever been a part of. A year and a half ago, I was on the phone discussing with them what I might talk about. It's been wonderful, wonderful working with that team. Thanks to Reverend McFall. Let's see, where did you? There you are. Thank you for your ministry here. Thank you for the whole ministerial team, for Diane and Charles. You're right here, yes, for picking us up at the airport. And I'm very excited today to have with me my partner, Gary Czar, who is right here, who I'm going to be talking about my book and who listened to every single page of it as it was written. So if he jumps up in the middle and says, "No, you got that wrong," please just be patient with him. But Gary, it's wonderful to have you here. So today I'm going to talk about the book, Call It Grace. I just finished it this past December. It's coming out March 19th. I put some postcards in the back. And the subtitle of it is Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. And Susan did such a good but very sad and painful job of describing why this church not only came to being in fractured times, but why those fractures and fissures still mark the terrain, the landscape of the world in which we find ourselves at this very moment. Before I launch into the whole notion of story that shapes and forms the book, I just want to say something about this word grace and what it means to me. And this means I'm going to get really theological right off the bat. For all of you sitting in this room, I hope the word grace evokes in its most simple form that short but most profound truth, that the love of God is something that falls equally upon us all, regardless of merit. It's unearned, it simply comes, it is, it always has been, and will be forever. It's the universal love of God. The deepest truth there is about our reality. That grace, as the Christian tradition has narrated it, began with the beginning of time itself, in fact, reaches back before then. It originates for each of us the moment we come into the world, blessed and loved by the God who calls us into being. It sustains us each moment of our life and continues to sustain us as it has in life beyond life, whatever that might look like. It's also the case that in our own lives, that grace is there all the time, but we can choose to open our eyes and see it, or we can keep our eyes closed to it. When we close our eyes to that ultimate truth about the universe, the love of God for it, then all sorts of terrible things happen. When our eyes are closed to it, we're actually living lies. And to live a lie means to live as if the world and each of us is not equally beloved of God. That, simply named, is sin. And it is impossible to talk about grace in human lives and as it relates to our beautiful, precious earth without simultaneously talking about the sin, human sin, which is the opposite, the eyes closed reality. And in the Christian tradition, we're very apt to talk about sin as something that is a personal failing. Usually it has been associated with sexuality. But in the writings of the Christian tradition, as we see in even Paul, the notion of sin is so much bigger than that. It has to do with life lived with eyes closed. And when that happens over time, especially in collectives of peoples, generation after generation, sin becomes itself a massive lie that creates and generates social structures that begin to look like reality to us. And those sins originating far back in time and coming forward towards us, original in their character, we see them around us everywhere today. The sins of white supremacy, the sins of patriarchy, the sin of capitalism, the sins of the violence we pour out upon the earth day by day, destroying it and ourselves along with it. In this particular moment, the sins of unbridled greed, of mass incarceration and mass deportation, the sin of a materialism and a moral vacuity that has riven this nation, riven us with the sins that have been passed down to us from generations before and threatened to run forward into the future, marking the lives of our children and theirs. In the Christian message, though, there is always the insistence that we have the chance every moment of every day to open our eyes to that grace, that love of God. And the minute one's eyes are opened, the world is transformed. It becomes a place of grace, and it cannot help but change your behavior. And when it is opened even more broadly to collectives, it begins to change the way we think about not only ourselves and our neighbors, but the world in which we find ourselves. And for me, that is what makes sin and grace both profoundly political notions. So the book that I started to write about 3 years ago was a book that I, as a theologian, was going to craft in such a way that the purpose of it was to take this notion of grace and bring together what theologians across the century have said about it, and by connecting it to a series of short little stories about my own life and the work of these theologians, make it intelligible to particularly secular people or people in religious communities who don't have a lot of theological background. This has a long tradition at Union Theological Seminary in the form of what is called public theology. As the president of Union, I was asked actually by my board to now deliver a public theology like Reinhold Niebuhr, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Paul Tillich. Can you imagine being told this? But that it was my time to now enter the realm of public theology, which is theology that speaks not only to the church, but speaks to the church as it lives in the public square, the world in which we find ourselves. So I had this whole plan for how I was going to write the book. I was going to talk about Calvin and Kierkegaard, move on to Niebuhr, then Barth, throw in a little Howard Thurman, talk about James Cone and Dolores Williams, Dorothea Zola, Luz Irigaray. And so I sat down to write, and as my fingers moved across the computer, what began to flow out was much different than what I had planned. I don't know, is it because I'm the first woman president and the way I do theology is so much different? But when I began to tell the stories in my own life of how I understand this connection between sin and grace, what poured forth from me were stories about my family and my own life that were much more complicated, riven, as I describe our world today, with that tension between the glorious in us and the broken in us. And before I knew it, I had written, much to my surprise, something like a theological memoir, where people like Kierkegaard and James Cone were still back and forth on every page of it, but what was driving it was the story of my own family. And upon completion of it, I looked at it, bewildered at what had happened, and it happened very quickly, and reflected on the whole notion of incarnation. And all the years I had spent as a theologian lecturing people on the incarnation as this strange, quirky reality in the Christian faith that holds that God became a human being and dwelt among us. God became incarnate as the most central truth of our faith. That what that is, that reality itself, that event, is a story in a life. Not about a life, in a life. And that theology at its best is, in fact, embodied in the enfleshed realities of the lives that we lead. My stories in this book are not unusual. All of our families have these stories. It's not particularly dazzling, although at times it is horrifying. But it is a story, nonetheless, in which the sin and grace that marks us all lives. And so today, I'm going to share with you this morning, first, two of those stories. They're the stories of my paternal grandparents. And then this afternoon, come back and tell you two more stories, more contemporary ones, about union and about my mother's recent death. All the while pulling us back into this tight bond between sin and grace, between the theology that lives in us and the politics and social reality in which we dwell. So my grandparents were both born in Oklahoma before it was a state. My grandmother, Ida Bell Seitz, was the child of Sooners. They were Pennsylvania farmers who, having gone bust in the East, rushed down to the Kansas border in 1897. My great-grandfather jumping on the back of a white stallion they'd bought with all the money they made from selling the farm, and drove that horse wild across the border to grab a flag out of the earth and take it to the land registry office in Enid, Oklahoma, where once he laid it on the table, they laid claim to a homestead that still stays in our family, north of Enid, Oklahoma, in a place called Billings, where they moved, built a sod hut, and my great-grandfather and great-grandmother spent the rest of their life turning rock-hard soil into arable land so that wheat could grow. They were derogatorily called sod busters. It was a derogatory term because people back east thought you had to be pretty stupid or desperate to come out into the middle of nowhere in a desert, prairie-like space and spend your days hammering the earth, trying to get it to bear fruit. The story of my grandmother, Ida Bell, is a story of grace. She never, ever in her life connected to the stories about God, and particularly the stories about Jesus that she read in the Bible, with anything other than a profound sense of gratitude for what her family had been given. And this is an old piece of earth that today, still farmed, now has an oil rig on it. A small trickle of sludge comes out of that dirt. I think probably less than $1,000 a year comes to my family from that money. But as I think about my grandmother's sense of its God-given nature, I'm also called to remember that the oil rig that now sits upon it plunges deep into the earth, now fracking the earth, causing earthquakes in Oklahoma, that 3 or 4 times a day knock the chimneys off of houses and open up chasms in an earth literally riven, tracing its history back to that original settlement. I'm also reminded, as I reached back and read these stories of their settlement, that no mention is ever made of the Osage people who lived there, because they were nomadic and didn't have houses or farms on the land. The land was considered free and open, unsettled. And so all of those hundreds of thousands of desperate people from the north and the south that came to Oklahoma when that call for free land went out were themselves desperately finding space through the displacement of another people now made desperate. My grandfather, her husband, named Dick Jones, came from another trail that led its way to Oklahoma. His grandfather was named R.B. Jones. Redman was his name. And he came from a family line that arrived in Oklahoma on what is now known as the Trail of Tears. His great-great-grandmother was a woman named Mary Brown, who in North Carolina, up near Cherokee, refused to leave her land when the call came out for all of the land titles held by Cherokee in the Cherokee Displacement Act of 1857, for all of the Cherokees to leave their land and march at gunpoint from North Carolina and Tennessee to Oklahoma to what then became Indian Territory, where they were to find a new life. 4,000 of the 17,000 who were taken on this genocidal march died either through murder or because of the weather and disease. And my relatives died on that trail. But Redman, my great-grandfather, made it. And my great-grandfather Redman ended up in a small town in the southern part of Oklahoma called Okemah. Okemah was the first place that the train stopped as it came from Tennessee into the state. And in 1898, the other part of my grandfather's family, they were known as the McMahons, came from Tennessee. And they came from Tennessee because my great-great-uncle had, in a poker game, killed a man when he lost and stole his horse. And in those days, stealing a horse was much worse than killing a man because the whole community depended upon the labor that the horse could provide. So they got on that train. The whole family had to come. They were Irishmen, and they were known for being wild and being cruel. And they came to the town of Okemah to escape. And it was in that town that Redman Brown met Dolly McMahon, and my grandfather, Dick Jones, was born. Dick Jones became a lawyer, and soon, by the time he was 40, was elected to the State Criminal Court of Appeals, which is the state Supreme Court body in Oklahoma. He was known as a brilliant litigator. He could tell stories of personally chasing outlaws, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, Ma Barker, across the plains of Oklahoma in the Great Depression era stories of the famous outlaws. He also loved to fish, which I think is a distant memory in him of his Cherokee roots. At night, he would hum melodies that none of us recognize and often speak in a language that even he did not know how to interpret. His closest fishing buddy, a man that he was committed to going fishing with, if not every day, at least 5 times a week, was the famous Congressman Melvin Porter, who in Oklahoma helped pass the first Civil Rights Act. He was in the first class of African Americans to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School. Their lifetime friendship created great change in the state for good. But my grandfather was also a man tortured, I believe, by that past he held within him, by that history, be it from the McMahons or the Browns, a child of a genocidal march and a drunken set of murderers ending up in that dirt new place called Okemah. So part of writing this book for me was a journey into these stories more deeply. And I'll share with you one of the biggest moments for me of what I call theological shock, but it's just darn right down and dirty shock, existential. I'd grown up hearing stories from my grandpa about everything Oklahoma. His mind never forgot a fact. That's what made him such a brilliant litigator. But when I was 39, I had been appointed now to a permanent tenured chair at Yale Divinity School and was leading a search committee for an appointment in African American religious thought. I had been in front of the people gathered in chairs much like this to hear the lecture of a man who was working on the figure of the African American pastor and how the body is imagined throughout history. And behind the lecturer, as I sat down and began to watch, dropped a series of horrifying postcards of lynchings. If you haven't seen the displays of these, you must. You can now see them in the new memorial to lynching in Montgomery, where these postcards are put up for us to see not only what lynching looked like physically, but the fact that it was treated throughout the country as an event of celebration for the white community. I'm watching these postcards drop on a screen as big as that cross back there, when suddenly a postcard drops, and it's a picture of a woman. She looks like she's maybe 21 in her Sunday clothes. Her black patent shoes are turned inward, her apron soiled, and she's hanging off a bridge. What I can't see in the postcard is that her son is hung next to her, age 12. It's a slice of the postcard. And at the bottom, it reads, Mary Nelson, Okemah, Oklahoma, 1911. In Okemah, Oklahoma in 1911, the population was maybe 500. And more than half of those people were the Browns and the McMahons. If my family had tried to stop or not participated in that lynching, I would have known that. The fact that no one in my family, my grandfather included, he would have been 6 years old, ever mentioned a word about it, is all the proof I need to know that they participated in it. And it's hard to imagine how they might have. I went back to read my grandpa's autobiography. Yes, you can imagine this man, this great lawyer, writing an autobiography. And not only did he not mention this, he mentions nothing in the entire book about the history of lynching in Oklahoma or even about the reality of Jim Crow. See, this lynching happened a year after Jim Crow laws fell on Okemah, Oklahoma. And what I do know is that when those laws fell, my grandfather Redmond was forced to sign a document that said he was pure white, even though he was Cherokee, so that he and Dolly could keep the land that they owned, because the new Jim Crow law said in this section of Oklahoma, in Okemah, only white people could own land. I also knew from my own study of history that at that time in Oklahoma, the whole southern sector was home to over 160 all-black towns, some of the wealthiest and thriving communities post-Civil War in the nation. And that a mere 10 years after this lynching, the largest racial holocaust in the history of the United States took place just up the road in Tulsa, where the white community, because they thought that a black man had tried to kiss a white woman in an elevator, dropped turpentine from airplanes on the ground, burning 3,000 homes, leveling them in the course of 4 days, and destroying what was then called the Black Wall Street of America, and sending out of Oklahoma this rich culture that had thrived there for 3 decades. It's not in the book. It's not in his book. It's not in the books that I was raised with. And here I was, now staring at a postcard. As I began to look into the story more, I learned all the background of this terrible lynching from the newspaper accounts from Okemah, in which its details are unfolded as if it's just an interesting human tale about what happened in Okemah over the weekend. I also learned and then saw the picture of the biggest postcard, the bigger postcard, which shows above Mary and Abel's bodies most of the town perched on the bridge. It's the bridge over the river where I went fishing with my grandpa often as a child. And the people are up there with babies on their hips, flags waving, picnics strewn around on the side of the bridge. It's a happy, exciting day. And you can't focus or see the faces of the people who were up there, but I know that on that bridge were my people. And for me, that moment in my own life, when dealing with the legacy of white supremacy in this country, went from being a story about what other white people did to other black people, to being a story about what my white family, my constructed, made-up white family, my real family, did to a real black woman, Laura Nelson, and her son. When one begins to grapple with the legacy of white supremacy in this country at that level, the whole camera frame begins to look different. Because you begin to trace back the privileges that you have accumulated directly back to the lives that were destroyed so that could accumulate towards you. For me, it takes the form of the fact that my grandfather went on to go to college. No one knows what became of the 6-month-old child that Mary Nelson laid down on the side of the bridge before she was dragged up to it. No one knows what became of that little girl, but Abel never had a chance. My grandfather went on to go to law school and went on to raise my father, who himself went on to Yale, who raised me with enough confidence about my place in the world that I too went on to get my PhD and now be president of a seminary in New York City. All of that predicated upon an act of violence that was hidden so deeply, and let me say multiple acts of violence, because the complicated thing about this story is the very families who were perpetrating this violence themselves came from lineages of violence. And so it rolls with sin and grace. I turned to James Baldwin often as I was wrestling through this, and continue to turn to James Baldwin, who says when he talks about race in America, he talks about grace a lot. First of all, James Baldwin never lets us forget that, as he puts it, The Swedes and the Norwegians, it could be any European group, but the Swedes and the Norwegians, when they arrived in this country, weren't white. They had to be made white. And how did you teach them to become white? You taught them what it meant to own bodies, to burn villages, to rape Native American women, to enslave black people, to have entitlements to rights that others did not have. You were molded and forced and became the white people, the white supremacist people that our country is still home to today. And Baldwin forces us to look that the construction of race in this country is not, as we have treated it for centuries, about the construction only of blackness. You had to make white people capable culturally of doing the things that they were able and capable of doing. The horrors inflicted required certain kinds of psyches and certain kinds of abilities. And those people are people from our families. And as a Christian understanding of original sin helps us see that the way in which these legacies are passed down to us are not always consciously. I bet very few of you in this room were raised in families that were consciously celebrating your racist heritage. But nonetheless, in that legacy are unconscious biases and ways of being and cultural intuitions and instincts that live and thrive nonetheless. Look at where we are today in this nation politically. So James Baldwin not only demands that we recognize the social construction of the whiteness that has been passed on as the whiteness of white supremacy, but he calls us to love. And he says the hardest thing to do in this nation that since its birth was built on hatred. It was hatred that was required to be drunk like the water in order for the nation to come to life. He said, in order for us to move beyond the nation that we are, we must move out of hate and we must move towards love. And then he says this, he says it so powerfully, he says, love takes off the masks. And by the masks, he means those constructions that we live in. He says love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without, but know we can no longer live within. And nothing less than this will save us. Nothing less than this love. By love, I mean not a trivial romantic kind, but a fierce social power. Baldwin says, that, my friends, is grace. Nothing less than grace can save us. Today we continue to live in two worlds. 3, 4, 5 worlds in this country. My daughter works at the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City. And each day she receives complaints from people who live in New York City who are complaining about harassment from the New York Police Department. And in her now 9 months in the job, she fields, her office of 80 fields over 100 calls a day. She herself is given 5 or 6. But in the hundreds of calls she's now dealt with in 9 months, not one call or interview has been with a white complainant. There's a war going on in New York City. A war that is fueled by a military system, a military-styled police department,
that because they're not addressing the social construction of white supremacy, have not even begun to train their officers to recognize the reality of what is happening, so that they too are able to take off that mask and see each other differently. These two worlds, we see them advocated from the highest pulpit in our country, the White House. We see them in our local politics as well. And it's interesting, and I will end here, as I have traveled around and over the last year begun to talk about this part of my family story, I get two different responses. The first time I told this story to any group other than my own family, even my own family's response was interesting to track. Some of them would shake their heads and says, "No, that's impossible." Some of them would just look embarrassed and say, "Serene, why are you talking about this?" And others in my family wept in anger. Changed them. The two responses I get in churches is one in Kansas City, in Ferguson, in a white church. The first time I told this story afterwards, I had 6 white men, all of whom were over the age of 70, standing in line to wait to talk to me, to tell me stories, with tears in their eyes, 2 of them sobbing, about their own family's complicit involvement in this awful legacy of chattel slavery and Jim Crow violence as it goes on into the present. One told a story about knowing his neighbor had killed a black man and buried him in their own backyard as a child. And he was now going to report this after 50 years of silence. And so those stories went that day. I came home with a sense of, oh my God, if this is one church, what are the magnitude of those white stories buried? Until we tell those stories, brothers and sisters, we are not going to move forward. That's what it means to understand the relationship of sin to grace. But then just a short while ago, I was preaching in Birmingham, and I told the same story. And person after church came up to me and said that they were really sorry to hear that I had such painful things to deal with in my family. Every single one. And the starkness of the comparison of how church, this was a white liberal church as well, but how it is in the white community, we deal with that legacy of white supremacy in this nation, in its real effects that they live on today, is the mark of the courage and the truth-telling, but also the humility with which we undertake the struggles that we're involved with. And nothing less than life or death is at stake. So I'll stop with that story and come back with some more after we have a question and answer time now, and then take a break.
Dr. Jones, thank you so very much. I'm over here. Let us express our thanks to Dr. Jones for this first part. My name is Fred Schrader. I'm also a member of Binkley. Let me give you some sense of our timing coming up. We'll have, in just a few seconds, opportunity for questions that you may have, and we'll have 2 microphones set up, one on this aisle and one on this aisle. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions, then we will break for coffee and refreshments in the narthex, and we will reconvene, I believe, at 11 o'clock to hear a second portion of your presentation. As to questions, not speeches, please. And we invite you to come forward. I'll try to alternate between the two aisles, so please come forward if you have questions. And I can't imagine that we would not. So please, come forward. Somebody's got to start. There we go. Thank you, Dolores.
So, Dr. Jones, welcome. I am crying over here because I've just recently done an Ancestry.com of my family and got to know that there are people that live, my folks that lived over and around Oklahoma. My question for you was, when you finally found how your family was actually connected and all of the things in the Cherokee background, how did it make you feel? What were you going through?
Yeah. At different points, I felt such dramatically different things, but I have to say that the day that I was in the lecture hall at Yale Divinity School and that postcard fell, and you know, I knew my family. I knew by the way my grandpa talked, the level of racism in my family. My own parents had never raised us that way. My dad was a very active civil rights activist. But I knew it was in my grandfather, but when I saw that picture fall, just at a physical level, I just wanted to throw up. Because suddenly what was someone else's story was my story. And I had to get up and lead the question and answers after this lecture had been given. And all I wanted to do was roll up in a little ball and go away, which of course never does anybody any good. And I went home that night and started reading through everything I could in my family's history to try to find something mentioned about this. I could find nothing. But I think it was I call it shock because it's that shock where the walls you build up around yourself. And I know that liberal people build those walls very high. Walls you build around yourself to protect yourself by saying, look how good a life I've lived. I'm not part of the problem, I'm part of the answer. And I was a nice liberal white professor at Yale Divinity School teaching liberation theology. And suddenly it was like a stone got thrown and that whole wall just shattered. And I was like, oh my God. It was devastating, and it was humbling, and it was eventually very empowering because the story and the history of white supremacy in the United States stopped to be, again, other people's story. It became my story and my responsibility. And so what started off as a shattering became a way to put it back together. I can't even begin still to get my mind around the Trail of Tears and that genocidal mark. Andrew Jackson used the word extinguished to talk about the burning of the titles to land, but he really meant it to refer to the Cherokee people living mostly in North Carolina at the time. That's harder to talk about because the trauma of that event was so total that when you have whole portions of your family actually extinguished, there isn't a trail to go back and find, except the trail that just ends in the absence of speech, in the absence of story. And that kind of gaping trauma is harder to even figure out how to engage.
You mentioned that we need to tell these stories, and I wonder if you have examples of places or ways that communities have figured out to allow the telling of the stories. I feel like most of our churches, 99% of the people are spectators, and the people telling the story are professional clergy. And how do we, or do you have any examples of empowering this storytelling?
Well, so I have not gone myself yet. I'm going to go in 3 weeks, but the museum that memorializes what we have of the documentation around lynchings across the country in Montgomery
is a powerful form of storytelling because it has a map, and you can see where all of the lynchings that they've documented happened, and you can go there and touch on the places that you've lived and read the stories and see the numbers. And of course, knowing all the time that these numbers are simply a fraction of the real numbers. But that's an attempt on the part of the community of historians, and in particular Brian Stevenson, to figure out how you tell history different. But I have heard, and am beginning to collect more of them, stories about how small towns and churches, not very many of them around the country, have actually begun to create memorials to the history and legacy of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and lynching in their community, and to have members of the community actually testify to their family's own history in relation to that, so that it's no longer simply a submerged history. It's a history that quite often in small towns, if they're mixed race towns, the black community knows well, but the white community has refused to speak about. But memorials that try to actually not lop off what for white people are the hard parts of the stories because of their own implication in it. But you don't have to, none of us have to dig very far into our family's past, probably. You just maybe have to look at a brother or sister now, but to find these histories. And I think, what is the Bible? What is the Bible if not a series of testimonies given by people who witnessed and were part of horrendous acts of violence, and who survived to tell the story, and on the other side of that violence, to try to carve out a different future. That is the whole of the Bible, New Testament and Old Testament put together. It's those stories.
I guess there's the follow-up. What about restoration?
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of any town, community, even your own community in Oklahoma, that has tried to find descendants? I know I read about a Catholic school, American University, I think it was. That,
Georgetown.
Yeah. Georgetown, that sold slaves to pay its debt, and now they're finding the descendants and trying to, give them scholarships and help. And I'm wondering if you have found any. I know one group not far from here in Chatham County that's trying to raise money to go to the museum in Montgomery, where you can get your own memorial and bring it to your community. Yeah. They have replicas, I understand.
And you can get a whole workbook on how to do.
But I was wondering about restoration for the people that were dispossessed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's interesting. The population in Okemah now, like so many very small rural towns, it's a trickle. It hardly exists as a town anymore. There's been such loss of the population. There's no industry. There's nothing there. What's even more devastating is of those 160 black townships in Oklahoma, I think maybe 3 of them are still sizable enough towns that you can notice them when you drive by them. So I think, as it is in large parts of America, how do you go about telling these stories when the communities affected by what happened and affected by so much else are simply gone? Okemah, the church that my grandparents grew up in, is closed. There's nothing there. So it's important to find ways in telling these histories to recognize how intimate and personal it is to one's lives. But in terms of reparations, it always has to be both a personal conversation and a national conversation. So what do we do about the fact that the legacy of what happened in Okemah created policies that put me in the presidency of the union, and policies that have completely obliterated the history of the child that survived. So there's a whole set of policies that over the decades made that possible and are still in place today. And as you know very well, in North Carolina, among them are policies related to voting, policies related to taxation. You know, in 2018, across the country, about 23% of the wealth of individuals was lost, but in the black community, the loss of wealth to African Americans who owned homes was about 75%. And that has I'm just using this as one example, exactly to do with policies around repossession, policies around loans, policies around how money is distributed and reclaimed. And those are all of the pieces that have to be pulled into this conversation about reparations, is how at a policy level do we shift that. And we need to be involved in that.
I'm working on a book and have for a long time. My parents and grandparents and so forth are from South Georgia, and were farmers. And I'm trying to find out, I found out some family stories and was really taken by your discovery of family stories. And mine include a certain amount of murder and mayhem. You know, it's wonderful that way. However,
Wonderful.
I was,
Very human that way.
Oh, yes, very human that way. But I know for a fact that one thing that is really, I've been really struggling with is the shadow behind my obviously white family. My parents were liberal professor of English and a librarian in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm from. But in South Georgia, where folks are from, the rest of my ancestors, I know that there are stories that I have not uncovered and I need to. What do you suggest, how do you suggest I begin that journey, that discovery place? Because I can't write without having the full picture. And taking my place in humility, what that picture shows.
Well, good for you for the work that you're doing on this. And I mean, it takes it's amazing how much you can do on the internet. A lot of my research, but also going to the place where records are left. I'm surprised how much of the history, the horrible history of this country, is actually in newspaper articles that had no qualms about telling the truth about what was happening, because it was considered normal. It was considered interesting. It wasn't considered criminal. It wasn't considered murder. But part of it is that if your family was white and they worked on or owned a plantation, they were implicated thoroughly in chattel slavery, which lasted 300 years, the most brutal, extractive labor system ever created in modern human history. It was cotton, well, in this case, cotton. But so you can assume, just like I have to assume with the lynching in the Okemah, that my family was there. They may have even led the lynch mob. I can't rule that out. And I'm left not knowing. Just one last thing I'll say real quick. One interesting piece of information that I gathered is that Woody Guthrie, who's also from Okemah, Oklahoma, actually grew up next door to my grandfather, so I grew up hearing about Woody Guthrie's family, and my grandfather's family always said that the Guthries were dirty white trash and you couldn't go play with them. So it was very interesting to have this like upstanding, really Cherokee and Irish family telling they couldn't go play with those dirty white trash Guthrie kids. But we're getting into class now here. But anyway, Woody Guthrie wrote about this lynching, wrote 2 songs about it that never became popular, and in the research he did that I read about, he says that his own father led the lynch mob. So Woody Guthrie's father was the one who riled up the civilian mob that did it.
We have a question on this side of the room, I believe. Please, over here.
As a theologian, I've just recently discovered Howard Thurman. Mm-hmm. And you spoke of the love that heals, what you were speaking of. Mm-hmm. Can you just give us a thumbnail of this nonviolent love that he imparted to Martin Luther King, and his whole gift to this world, not intellectually, but from his grandmother, right? And his experience of growing up. I mean, I've never encountered a black theologian in my career, and I've studied theology myself, so it's just been a really recent discovery, and it rocks my soul. And if you could add to it, because you have this background, I think, too, would you, please?
Yeah. So Howard Thurman plays a big role in this book, and I could talk all day about Howard Thurman. Just to add to the list, though, I think reading James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, is a very important piece of this. That's where the quote comes from. James Baldwin, not explicitly a theologian, but he can't get it out of his system, and says some of the most profound theological things about this nation that I've ever read. And then also, just to add to your list, I would recommend James Cone, who was professor and founder of Black Liberation Theology at Union Theological Seminary. He passed away this past April. And he has a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in which he chronicles the understanding of the cross that his parents had in Arkansas. In this book, I end the book by describing how James Cone's parents were making their way forward in Arkansas as very poor black people, dealing with the reality of lynching. At the same time, my grandparents, Ida Bell and Dick, were making their way forward just over the state line in Oklahoma as white people, poor and trying to make their way forward, and the two very different views of the cross that they had. And for James Cone, the redemptive power of the cross was not that God demanded a sacrifice, but that for black people on the cross, they knew, they saw, they felt God's solidarity with the lynched, that the cross was a lynching device. And it was a first-century lynching that sits at the center of the Christian story. It's an amazing book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Howard Thurman, for those of you who don't know, was a professor at Boston University, grew up in Florida. His mother had been a slave, so he grew up with stories that were very real to him. He was the professor who most influenced the theology of Martin Luther King, and his writings are voluminous. Of the many volumes of work there are in the field of black theology, Howard Thurman is most known for being the mystic in the bunch. He's very mystical about his perspective on nonviolence. And that all comes in him out of this deep belief in the fundamental, not only equality of human beings, but he has this image, he says, that in all of us, in the great sea of self that we are, in the infinite sea inside of us, there is an island. And on that island is an altar. And on that altar is a fire. And in that fire, one finds the flames of the soul. It is in that fire that we meet God, the flames of the soul. And it is in that fire that we meet God, on the altar, on the island, in the infinite sea of the self. Howard Thurman then talks at great length about all the things in our lives that prevent us from reaching that island and seeing that altar and feeling the heat of that flame. And for him, in dealing with his own experience of the violent history of white supremacy in this country, he, like James Baldwin, talks extensively about this tension between seeking justice, seeking change, demanding a different structure, and yet at the same time, not but and, not letting that structure define who you are, because it's wrong, simply a lie. I thought about this a lot last week with the United Methodist vote not to ordain or allow LGBTQ people to be married. And I thought about how we're always, as Christians, what does it mean to live with knowledge that when it comes to God's view of the world, a lie has been enacted? And how do you both live in a world that is defined by the lie, and yet you yourself do not live or believe the lie? Because it's a lie. A theology that says that LGBTQI people are not equal or deserving of all of the beauty and abundance of God's love is simply a lie. And yet it's a lie that has reality to it, because it now is clamping down even harder on their lives. And yet, they're called to live in the truth of that grace, that love that defines them otherwise. So this tension between living between lies and love is the same thing as living in the tension between sin and grace. It's like that place we are caught and called to live it out.
I think we have time for one more question, and I believe you've been waiting.
First, Glenn Hinson, who was a folklorist in American Studies at UNC, is taking his students to interview descendants of lynched people to hear about the lives that have followed in the wake of such.
So just to add to that, we need to start interviewing the descendants of the lynchers. That's part of this is part of what I think that the shift of the story needs to be about slavery and Jim Crow in this country. It's just not a story about what happened to black people. It's a story about what white people did. So anyway.
Yes. I'm thinking, too, of the coming to the table workshops that are done at Easton Mennonite University, where descendants of slave holders and descendants of enslaved people are coming together to tell their stories. And I do think that telling that story is where we're at. So my question is, when you have told your story and people come up to say, how sad for you, can you model an answer for us that moves you through that moment and into the next conversation? Because I think we all live that moment and don't know how to get past it. Do you have any suggestions for public language that will move us into the next part of the conversation at that moment?
So at a personal level, when people say how sad that, I'm getting a double feedback here. Maybe I'll turn this down. Or maybe if I take this off. Okay, I'll turn this, now this is better, this work, okay, yeah, it's not double. So personally, I just ask people, I say, you don't have any stories like that in your family? How long have you lived in Birmingham? I mean, I just forthright, how many generations back does it go? Well, just tell me, what do you know about your family? And you don't have to ask very many questions before, it becomes apparent that you have to move past the I'm so sorry for you if you're going to talk about your own past. In terms of modeling how we do it as a whole nation, it was very interesting. I have my own niece who has been helping me work on the book. I have a story in the book where I talk about, I think it was my 9th birthday. We were living in Richardson, Texas. My dad is a big civil rights activist. We're embroiled in a battle for the school board where my father's running a campaign where the first black man is running to be elected to the Dallas School Board. John Birch Society's been attacking us. Our phone is. We're just like in the throes of the civil rights movement, and I'm getting ready to go to my birthday party, and the car is filled with all my friends, and the suburb we live in is white, all my white friends, and we get to the public pool, and it says closed for repairs. And so my dad gets back in the car and says, okay, we're going to Lake Highlands because I bet that pool's open. Lake Highlands in Dallas, if you know it, is all black community. And out of the back seat comes this voice of a little girl who says, oh, gross, I don't want to swim with black people. And my dad slams on the brakes. He gets out and he said, "Who said that?" I raised my hand. I said that. Here is a child of activists expressing in that moment what every white little girl in that car felt. And that's what's called implicit bias. And those are the fears that live within us that we don't even know. And here's my dad was like shocked. And he told me that I'd done the worst thing I could possibly do, and that I had a choice. I could either go, we were turning around and going home, I could either go to my birthday party and finish the day out with my friends this year, or never have another birthday party the rest of my life. So I chose to go back to my bedroom and cry. But I think I tell that story because it's, it's not just stories about the long past. How did that come out of me? You couldn't find a more progressive family than my family, and there it was. So I think the more we tell those stories too, and talk to parents about how do you parent around this. We have to talk to parents. Probably my dad, telling me I could never have another birthday party the rest of my life, it did, sear into me the importance and the seriousness of what had happened. It probably wasn't a really good parenting strategy. In a teachable moment, to talk to all of the girls in the car about what I had said and why I had said it. But, so.
On that very thoughtful response, we now have a lot to talk about. We will take a break until 11 o'clock. Please be back in the sanctuary at 11. There is coffee and I think other wonderful things out there in the narthex. Please enjoy.